Should have a picture. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Right. Well, I want to thank the organizers of this symposium for inviting me to present a paper and to discuss the work of Jan Platvoet. I'm extremely pleased and honored to be asked to do this. I first met Jan in Harare in 1989 when I was a lecturer in the Department of Religious Studies, Classics and Philosophy in the University of Zimbabwe. And he was part of a team dealing with the University of Utrecht, University of Zimbabwe joint program on religious education in Zimbabwe. Later, in 1992, he was the international coordinator for the Regional International Association for History of Religions, the IAHR conference, which was held in Harare in September of that year, and I was the local organizer for the conference. This was the landmark meeting that founded the African Association for the Study of Religions. I learned a great deal from Jan during the preparations of this conference and the deliverance of the papers and so on, so much so that it helped me immensely when I went to Edinburgh in 1993 and became the coordinator of the African Christianity Project. I also worked with Kerry Tahar on that, and we organized a lot of conferences. Jan's model was one that I followed quite closely, and I learned a great deal from him. Jan and I also worked together on an edited book along with Jacob Olopona that emerged from the Harare Conference in 1992, resulting in the book, The Study of Religions in Africa, Past, Present, and Prospects, published in 1996. Over the years, we've consulted and collaborated in many conferences and some publications, and I owe a great deal, as Kerry mentioned, to the insights I've learned from Jan Platvoet, particularly in recent years since I've developed a restricted and limited definition of the category indigenous religions. In 1992, the Utrecht Zimbabwe Collaborative Program produced a book published by the University of Utrecht called African Traditional Religions in Religious Education, edited by Kerry Tahar, Ambrose Moyo, and S.J. Nondo, in which a section appears entitled African Traditional Religions in the Religious History of Humankind. The author was Jan Platvoet. The same chapter with an identical title appeared a year later in an article in the South African journal, the Journal for the Study of Religion. Now this article, if you go back to it, is succinct, complete, historical, erudite. It offers an impressive overview of African traditional religions, both historically and in terms of the basic characteristics that Platvoet attributes as defining what he means by African traditional religions. I relied on this article in a number of my lectures given at the University of Edinburgh to undergraduate students, and also on a later chapter which came out of the book that Jacob Olopona and I edited, which he entitled the chapter, The Religions of Africa in Their Historical Order. Over the past 10 years, I've extended the discussion of ATRs to apply to indigenous religions generally. I dealt in most detail with Platvoet's contribution to this subject in my book of 2007, entitled From Primitive to Indigenous, the Academic Study of Indigenous Religions. I explain in that book that Jan Platvoet is a scholar who is important for helping me arrive at a scientific approach to classifying indigenous religions, because Platvoet self-consciously employs an empirical method based on an in-depth historical studies, and in this case, African traditional religions. It's his commitment to this inductive, scientific method that provides the starting point for how I used his classification of African traditional religions to arrive at a limited and restricted definition of indigenous religions. In this paper, I want to summarize my analysis of Platvoet derived from my book From Primitive to Indigenous, offer some further comments, and I look forward to some comments from him for the first time in public on my argument that I made in that book. In his 1992-93 article on African traditional religions and the religious history of humankind, Platvoet divides religions between what he calls community religions and those that are transnational. A community religion, he explains, is, quote, particular to a single society, and thus is practiced by all the members of that society and no one outside it. This means that such religions are coextensive with single societies and refer also, in a larger sense, to what might be called ethnic or national religions. Before 250 BCE, this type of religion was the only kind of religion, he says, in existence, and most religions since then belong to this category. A person is born into this kind of religion, and since such religions do not have any concept of conversion, they are entirely non-missionary in nature. Such religions can be contrasted to the transnational religions. Transnational religions appeared relatively recently in history. Quoting Platvoet, when Buddhist monks first spread the teachings of the Buddha beyond India. They now include Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, what he calls exclusive transnational religions, and more recently, movements as diverse as Mormonism, Baha'i, Transcendental Meditation, Bhagwan, Scientology, New Age. Transnational religions, on Platvoet's analysis, are world religions, as opposed to the more limited and restricted nature of community religions. So we have the first division in Platvoet's classification of types of religion, community and transnational. But it's not so simple as that. Platvoet then divides community religions into literate community religions and community religions of oral societies. Literate community religions, he explains, began sometime about 3,500 BCE in Egypt, Mesopotamia, northern India, and later in China and Mexico and Peru. Such societies developed agricultural methods of production and established states with an elite upper class developing alongside a population of laborers. Platvoet conjectures that writing was devised initially for record-keeping of goods used in trade, but later evolved into many other functions, including the codification of laws, the recording of myths, and for the regularizing of ritual practices. Community religions of oral societies, by contrast, he says, are the oldest group of religions and are, quote, lost in the mists of the roughly 4 million years of the genesis of humankind from the pre-human primates. The earliest mode of economy of such societies entailed nomadic food gathering, which in turn was reflected in the religious life of the people. Later, a more sedentary way of life developed as animal husbandry was adopted, but this still involved moving the livestock to locations where feeding grounds were plentiful. Later, full-blown agricultural societies developed. In each case, the means of production was mirrored in the religious beliefs and practices. As life came to depend less on abundance of game and more on the ability of people to nurture crops and animals, so did the religious life and practices of the people change. As such, mystical trances to encourage animals to surrender to the hunter, as evidenced in the nomadic types of peoples and developed through forms of shamanism, yielded particularly to the performance of sacrificial rituals as at persuading ancestors and deities to provide plentiful rain to ensure a fruitful harvest. Now it's clear from this brief summary of Platvoet's description of human religious development, and it is much more complicated than I presented it, it's clear that indigenous religions, taken as a whole, and not just in Africa, are included in the category community religions of oral societies. In his 1996 paper, The Religions of Africa in Their Historical Order, he explains that the category of the African traditional religions comprises all the community religions of the indigenous societies of Africa since Paleolithic times, and adds, they are the normal and normally the only religions south of the Sahara before the heyday of European colonialism, which he puts as 1920 to 1950. Now, Platvoet does not limit his discussion of African traditional religions, or more broadly to indigenous religions, to their means of production and their development throughout history, but he also discusses the characteristics of such religions. And especially in his 1992-93 article, he discusses and outlines the characteristics of these types of religions. And I'm not going to go into all of his characteristics, but some that I think are the most important. We've already met one major characteristic. The traditions are transmitted orally. He ascribes other descriptive traits to such religions, such as rituals are central to their religious practice. Beliefs are not articulated in a systematic way, but remain vague and appear often to outsiders as contradictory, what he calls multidimensional. They are recipients of constant revelation, spirit mediums, or those that communicate directly with the spirit world. Their concept of salvation is tangible and material, aimed at securing benefits in this world rather than in a life after death. Now, although I agree with Platvoet on these points, I do not think they describe uniquely the characteristics of indigenous religions. Some of the traits that he identifies I would call secondary rather than primary. Take, for example, what Platvoet considers as critical, the oral nature of community religions. This, I think, is secondary because all religious traditions, even those traditions of the book, like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, originally were oral in nature, and some of the most important activities today retain their emphasis on orality. In Islam, for example, committing the Quran to memory is a sign of high religious devotion. Or Christianity, hearing the word of God in ritual and in preaching leads to action in society. Or consider Platvoet's argument that indigenous religions are pragmatic rather than dogmatic or doctrinal, meaning that their religious explanations are flexible and can even appear to outsiders as contradictory. Well, I would say, yes, this is true, but in some senses, all rituals in all places are pragmatic. That is, they aim at achieving a practical result for practitioners. Some sociologists, for example, Stark and Bainbridge, have argued that the primary aim of religions everywhere is to maximize gain and reduce deprivation, arriving at the fundamental point that salvation, at least in some of the transnational religions, can be regarded as aiming for benefits in this life only. And I think this is a primary contention of the Christian theology of the kingdom of God. Well, within Platvoet's incisive 1992-93 article, I've discovered what I consider two closely related primary, as opposed to secondary characteristics that provide the key to distinguishing indigenous religions from all other types of religions. Platvoet contends that the localized nature of African traditional religions means that people direct their attention towards community deities or spirits which are kinship-based. He describes the cosmologies of such societies as reflecting, quote, small mental worlds, since the rituals and beliefs of the African community religions developed in local settings and resulted from, quote, long ages of restricted outward communication. Even when territorial boundaries are extended in traditional societies, they are interpreted in kinship terms, and institutions are structured on the model of kinship. Platvoet then makes what I consider to be his central point about the indigenous religions of Africa, and by extension, indigenous religions everywhere. Kinship rules religion. He reaches this conclusion because, to quote him, the deceased, for as long as they are ritually approached as ancestors, are treated as the foremost members of the social worlds of these societies. Even non-ancestral spirits, called by Platvoet other meta-empirical beings, are given quasi-kinship status. As community-based, kinship-orientated societies, the traditional religions of sub-Saharan Africa clearly fit into a larger scheme of classification that includes similar communities in other parts of the world, what I have called indigenous religions. So in these important early writings of Jan Platvoet on African traditional religions, I find confirmed my first contention that indigenous societies are restricted by kinship relations. One is born into an extended family, or one marries into it. Marriage regulations are carefully controlled to ensure that kinship ties are preserved and that traditional relationships between different peoples are observed according to the regulations of the society. Some are hierarchical, others more egalitarian, some patrilineal, others matrilineal. But the one factor they share in common is that they are all defined by and limited to patterns of kinship. If one applies this interpretation of indigenous to the religions of indigenous peoples, this means that unlike religions with universal cosmologies, one can never be converted into an indigenous society, since ancestors belong only to precise kinship groups. The second defining characteristic, again inspired by Platvoet, that I have identified as unique or primary to indigenous societies, stresses that they are restricted not only by kinship ties, but relate exclusively to a particular geographical place or location, fixed in the tradition by their quasi-legendary myths. Platvoet notes that most people in traditional societies are, quote, familiar only with the territory in which they themselves live and part of that of their neighboring communities. Foundational stories are relayed to the young and passed on from generation to generation. These local myths form the background in which rituals performed regularly in honor of the ancestors are conducted. When misfortunes occur, for example, explanations are sought to determine why the ancestors have withheld their protection and allowed bad things to happen. The reasons given usually point to the failure of the descendants to remember and honor their ancestors in rituals, or they refer to some serious social infraction committed within the community which offends the ancestors. The resulting series of catastrophic events can only be rectified when the ancestors are reconciled to the community, almost always by performing rituals aimed at restoring relations with the ancestors and by making compensation to injured parties who have been impacted by the infringing of traditional social mores. The problems encountered by communities, including divining the causes and prescribing the proper treatments, occur exclusively within specific geographical regions over which the ancestors are responsible and do not extend beyond the boundaries of their traditional authority. So, following Platvoet's commitment to an empirically based scientific analysis, I have arrived at a narrow and restricted definition of the term indigenous religions. This is done largely, as Platvoet's insisted that we do, that we define or say what we mean when we use terms, operationally, scientifically, and empirically. Kinship and location, as irreducible, defining qualities, provide students of religion with a clear, testable, and scientific criteria for denoting what is and what is not an indigenous religion. If an identifiable community seeks converts, aims at expanding its followers or members beyond a specific geographical location through missionary efforts, as opposed to migrations or warfare, and defines adherence in terms of beliefs and practices that are not limited by kinship ties, they cannot be considered an indigenous religion. In accordance with a scientific method that depends on empirical verification to test the data, the transmission of tradition within any community can be designated indigenous only if the overwhelming authority of the tradition derives from the ancestors and the primary identity of the community is confined to specific geographical locations.
Thank you.